everyone, and welcome back. Today is a little bit of late content. Whoops, I'm late. Shock. Who is surprised? But I wanted to kind of do a mid-year check-in with you guys, talk to you about some of my best books of the year so far, some of my worst books of the year so far, and just give you kind of like a general update on how I'm doing with series and what my stats have looked like for the year. Most people do the mid-year freakout tag, and I'm not a huge fan personally of the mid-year freakout tag. The questions just don't really apply to me super well, and when I'm looking for mid-year content, I personally prefer to know what people's best books of the year were, worst books of the year were, most disappointing books of the year, and kind of how their reading year has shaped up so far. That's what I look for, so that's how I'm going to be structuring my mid-year content. So I did see a lot of best and worst of the year. However, Cassidy from Covers with Cassidy did one where she told you the best and worst of each month, and I like that idea. Hopefully she doesn't mind me borrowing that, because I think that that's a good way to give you a tease of what my best books and worst books are so far without totally giving away my top 10, because there could be other books in the month that would boot out something that is on my best of that particular month, if that makes sense. So I'm excited to kind of do it that way, and I think that that'll be a lot of fun for me and a lot of fun for you, and maybe you can guess what wasn't on the list that might make my top 10 or my most disappointing books of the year. So I guess I'm just going to go through the stats in each month. So we'll talk about January first, then February, but I did want to quickly give you guys a little bit of stats on how I'm doing with series, because I know at the beginning of the year, one of my goals was to read more series. And by read more series, I mean continue in series and not start series. Have I been successful in that? No. No, I have not. So this year I have managed to start 41 series. Oh my God, that's bad. That's bad. However, I have DNF'd at least 12 series so far this year, so that helps a little bit, and a lot of those series that I started are series that I DNF'd after the first book. So like if I read, for example, Lady of Rooksgrave Manor, which you will see in a little bit, I'm not continuing in that series. So even though it's technically a series and gets marked off as a series on my spreadsheet, it's a DNF almost instantly because I have no intention of continuing in that series. I did get up to date 5 series and I did finish 4 of them, which means that I currently have about 127 active series going on, and I have 71 that I am currently like in progress on. So that kind of 127 just talks about all of the active series that I had at the beginning of the year. And then at the end of the year, I will talk to you guys about the ones that I DNF'd, the ones that were completed. Those will kind of move out of my active series for the next year. So I have 127 at the beginning of the year. Out of that 127, I have caught up on 27, completed 4, and I am currently in progress on 71 of them. So it could be worse. It could be better, for sure. So I guess let's just get into each month and what my best, my worst, and what my stats looked like. Okay, so stats for January. In the month of January, I managed to read 15 books, so it was a really good reading month. I read 6,420 pages or so, about 200 pages per day, so that's pretty solid. My average rating was a 6.72, which is a 3-star, no one's surprised. Most of my books that month were audiobooks, with ebooks coming in close behind, and my most read genre was fantasy, with horror not too far behind it. Let's talk about my best and the worst of the month of January. So the best of the month of January was actually Shades of Madness by Chiego Abdallah. I got an art copy of this and it came out around my birthday, so happy birthday to me. Thank you, Chiego. But this is a series following an expansive world where we have basically like a zombie type plague set in a fantasy world. We're following 3 different characters, one who is the son of a king, one who is a like priestess kind of, and one that is a hunter-gatherer. And there's a lot of really cool magic in here. I am terrible at giving a synopsis of this book, and I think Chiego laughs at me every time I try, so that's about as good as it's gonna get. But this was the sequel to that, and I really, really enjoyed the sequel. I thought that it did expand the world in a really cool way. It had you know, just a lot more character development that I really appreciated. It is kind of the second book in a series, so we didn't move the plot forward quite as much as I wanted it to, but that means that I am so excited for book 3. I think that it's going to be breakneck and so much fun, and I cannot wait for it to also make my best books of the year, because I think it might be coming out later this year. But I adored this book so much, and I mean, you just can't get a cooler cover than that, so it automatically gets points, right? And then for my worst book of the month of January was unfortunately How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. We read this one for the unofficially official book club, and I just did not love this one. I was in the minority, along with Cassidy as usual, where this was just not my type of horror book. Grady Hendrix really leans into the campiness and to the fun part of horror while also still having a horror story. But unfortunately for me, I find that his stories a lot of times lose logic, and that's what happened here. I was bored for the beginning of it, where we were talking about kind of the grief horror, but it wasn't the type of grief horror that I typically like. And there was a lot of like bickering between family members, and then we went into the more horror side of things, and it just lost all logic, and so therefore it lost me, unfortunately. So that one was probably my least favorite book of January. I hate to say worst book, because that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a bad book. It just was my least favorite book of January. Alright, so for February, I actually read more books, even though there are less days in the month, so that's exciting. This was the month that we did the 72 Hours in the Haunted House readathon, which was a lot of fun and probably contributed some to those numbers. I read 18 books, and then I read 6,334 pages with around 225 pages a day, and my average rating was better at a 6.86. For the most part, I did audiobooks, but I actually had a pretty good span of audio, ebook, and physical that month. Most of my books were fantasy and horror. Both of those were even at about a 7, which again, not surprising because that's the month that we did 72 Hours in the Haunted House. So my best book, I think, of February was From Cold Ashes Risen by Rob J. Hayes. This is the third book in the, I think, War Eternal series following Eska, and I freaking love Eska. The first book follows her when she is in a prison, actually, and she's trying to like get her way out of this prison. It is about people that can swallow, they're not really elements and they're not really metals, but like sources, and they give them different powers. But the catch is, if you aren't attuned to that source, it's going to kill you in seconds. If you are attuned to that source, it's still going to kill you. It's just going to take a little bit longer. And I just think that that magic system is such a cool way of doing things. This is the third book and kind of the final book in the first arc of Eska. And then there is a second arc that happens many years later. I freaking loved this book. I thought that it was amazing from start to finish. There is one of my favorite character relationships in here. It does have a particular trope or archetype that I absolutely love, and so it's not a surprise that I gave this 5 stars and flew through it. This first arc, and probably this series as a whole, is going to be one of my favorite series of all time. And then my worst book, or my least favorite book of February, was Lady of Rooksgrave Manor by Catherine Moon, I believe is the author's name. This one I read with Steph from Steph Loves and Cassidy for the Cliterature Book Club, and it was a time. This is a monster reverse harem, and it's not really a romance, it's just like smut on smut on smut. And so there really wasn't a lot of plot, there wasn't a lot of characters, and if you know me, then you know I need plot and characters. I can't just have vibes. And unfortunately, that's what this was, smutty vibes. I was not in the minority of people that did not love that one, so at least there's a win for that. I was not in the minority not liking a book, but it was just not, it was not the book for me. If you're looking for a really smutty time with some cool monster characters, then absolutely, you need to give that one a go. But good smutty time was not my kind of good time. Then in the month of March, I read 18 books once again, but this time it was 8,000 pages, so lot better than I did in the month of February and January. I read about 260 pages a day, and my average rating was the best that it's been this year at 7.14. That is like a really high 3-star, almost a 4-star, so look at me go in the month of March. I did DNF one book, so maybe that helped. Most of the books that I read were audiobooks, but I did a lot of like mixture in that month where I would listen along with reading, or I would flip back and forth between 2 different formats. And mostly I read fantasy in this month. It looks like fantasy and horror actually are going to be my top 2 most read genres this year so far, but mostly I read fantasy books. So my favorite book of the month of March was Fireborn. I loved this book. I did not expect to love this book. I've heard such good things about it for so long, and I just kept putting it off because it's a young adult, and I was like, I'm not really feeling the young adult. Like, I want epic, I want complicated, and I want great world building and good characters. That's what this is. It's got such great world building, such great characters. It is a little messy because it does have some angst, teenage angst in there, but honestly, that just made me love the characters all the more. The politics in this, guys, the politics in this were top tier. Like, it was absolutely amazing. I felt like I was completely in this world with these characters, and again, it's going to be one of my favorite series of all time. So if you like dragons, but you don't want your dragons to be like dragons, like these dragons are kind of like horses, but a little better than horses, but you love politics and you like a little bit of angst in your stories, great action scenes, you need to pick this up right now. You got it? You want to take it? Take it, take it, take it. You need this book. Okay, and then my least favorite book of March was Just the Nicest Couple by Mary Kubica. This is a thriller that I read for, I believe it was Cassidy's Patreon readathon to see how many books I could read in 24 hours. And I just did not love this one. It's a very slow domestic thriller that I was bored for most of it, and then I didn't find that the twist was all that engaging, so it just didn't work for me. If you're somebody that likes domestic thrillers, then you might like this one a little bit better. But when I say thriller, I use that term loosely because I wouldn't say that this is a very fast-paced book by any means. I have read a Mary Kubica or two before that I did quite like. This one just did not work for me at all. All right, and then moving on to the month of April, this was by far my best reading month of the year, which is not a surprise because it was the month of Realmathon, and I hosted Team Ilma, and we won, whoop whoop. But I was on the sci-fi team, and I read so many books. I read 7,689 pages, which actually is less pages than I read in March, but more books. I read about 256 pages a day, and my average rating was about the same that it had been most of the other months, around a 6.7. Most of those books were audiobooks. I did start a lot of series in that month, and then I read primarily sci-fi, which again is not a surprise because I was on the sci-fi team for Team Ilma. Comically, my favorite book of April is not my most read genre, not the genre that I should have been reading in the month of April, but a fantasy romance. It was Serpent in the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. And when I say favorite genre, I mean fantasy is typically my favorite genre, and this is a fantasy romance, so I still feel like we could probably count it as fantasy, but like I was supposed to be reading sci-fi in the month of April. And I did, but it wasn't my favorite. This was my favorite. Serpent in the Wings of Night is a vampire story that is so unique. There is slow burn, enemies to lovers, like check a box, check a box. There is a tournament, check another box. There is a feisty main character, check another box. Like complicated relationships. This book had so many buzzwords for me, and it delivered them all really, really well. This is about Araya, who is the daughter of the vampire king, essentially, and she's a human, but she is going to enter this tournament, the Kajari. She's going to enter this tournament, the Kajari, and that should allow her, if she wins, to essentially be given the powers of a vampire so that she no longer has to worry about being this lowly mortal human. And I just love how Carissa managed to make this slow burn in an interesting way. Like, the story revolves around the romance, but if you took the romance out, you would still have a really awesome main character. You would still have a really cool plot, but the plot would not be as engaging without the romance. Does that make sense? So this is still a fantasy romance, but I would not call this as a romantasy because I feel like the fantasy elements are really, really strong in here, and I just love this. I think that Carissa tackles relationships in one of the best ways, and I'm not even talking about romantic relationships. She tackles friendships really well. She tackles like parent relationships extremely well, and I absolutely adored this book. Adored it. It was amazing. My least favorite book of April is a sci-fi, and that was Paradise 1 by David Wellington. This is a sci-fi horror thriller. Unfortunately for me, I think the main thing that did not work for me in this one is that it was just way too action-packed. If you are looking for something that is action from like the first moment and never gives up on it, then this might really work for you. I loved the first couple of chapters, and then I felt like it was just too much. We were never slowing down. We were never learning anything about the characters. We were never really learning anything about the plot because it was just action, 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 action. And so I got bored because there was nothing for me to grip onto. I'm not somebody that loves constant action scenes. I do need for there to be a little bit more, I hate to say the word substance, but it feels like that. I just need a little bit more to grip onto. And so without a lot of character development or without a lot of like engaging plot or even world building, because I still feel like you can have world building in sci-fi, I kind of fell off of this one and wasn't as interesting. This ends on a massive cliffhanger, and I can't even remember what the cliffhanger was, if that tells you how unengaged I was with that book. Okay, moving on to May. So 2 more months left. In May, I read 18 books. I read 7,000 pages, 226 pages a day, and my average rating was a 6.5. Most of those books were audio with a pretty decent amount of ebook and physical. And then my most read genre, once again, was fantasy. And this is the month that I read crack. Like, this is the month that I got addicted and read crack. Like, there are crack in these pages, I swear. But it's the month that I read Fourth Wing, and I really enjoyed this book. I will admit that I was one of those that was a little on the fence in the beginning because it read so young adult to me. There were a lot of young adult tropes and things of that nature, but once I got to about a third of the way through, the crack finally got me and I was hooked. I loved the way that this tackled world building. I thought that that was really well done. I did like the relationship and the romance. It wasn't my favorite part of the story, but I did really, really enjoy it. I think that the world building is going to expand even more in the next book, and I'm so excited for that. And I really loved the dragons in here, even though they are very much so an integral part of the story. They were so much fun, and the relationships between the dragons and the dragon riders, I just thought that this was extremely well done, and I had a great time with it. So absolutely love this one. Yeah, I'm one of those girls. I can't help it. I'm sorry. My least favorite book in the month of May, however, was Trial of the Sun Queen. This is the month that we hosted 72 Hours in the Smut Den, and I don't read a lot of like romance, but I did read a decent amount of fantasy romance, which is, you know, Fourth Wing, although I don't think I read Fourth Wing during 72 Hours. Anyway, Trial of the Sun Queen was one that I had a lot of hopes for. It also had the enemies to lovers trope with a trial, and I thought that it was going to be something that would be a new favorite, but unfortunately for me, it did not work at all. I don't remember it super well now, honestly, but I remember not liking any of the characters. I remember thinking that the world building was just not done in a way that I could appreciate, and this was not a time. Like, the longer I read, the more annoyed I got, and I'm really kind of shocked that I finished it, honestly. Okay, and then for the month of June, I read 10 books. I only read 4,000 pages in the month of June. This is not terribly uncommon where, like, we go hard for Ramathon, and then May is okay, and then June just kind of goes, So yeah, June was not a great reading month for me. I only read like 140 pages a day. My average rating stayed about the same at a 6.5. I read a pretty even amount of fantasy romance, and sci-fi. Thriller, not sci-fi, thriller. My favorite book of June was Blood Mercy by Bella Roth. There have been quite a few fantasy romances on my tops of the year so far. I really appreciated this story. Now, where Serpent in the Wings of Night has all of my buzzwords, this one has all of my anti-buzzwords, but it was still done in such a good way, an incredible way, that I was hooked and engaged and really appreciated this story. This is also following vampires, but they are called Hespertine, and it's a completely different way of looking at vampires. Normally, they're like the big bads that suck blood, but that's not at all what these characters are, and there is a treaty and a conversation going on between the Hespertines and the humans to try to kind of come to an understanding and more peace, and this happens every few hundred years. Our main character is Cassia, and she is a human. She's the daughter of a king, and she just wants to meet these Hespertine, and then we also have Leo, who is a Hespertine. And I just thought that the character development in this was amazing. The way that Cassia grows from the beginning to the end of the story is incredible. There's really, really good world building in here. It does read a little bit more on the formal side, and a lot of the world building is done through dialogue, yet it still feels very natural and flowed very well for me. I'm excited to get to know more about the world. The major downside for this one was unfortunately the plot, and the plot was not really existent. So I'm hopeful that in future books we do get a little bit more plot and movement rather than just character development and relationships, but I still really appreciated that part of this book and thought it was extremely well done. And my worst book of June was actually The Archive Undying by Emma Miko Kandon. This one is a sci-fi that was just a little too out there for me. It was intentionally written in a very confusing way, and it showed. I don't know what the author was really trying to accomplish by that, but I actually went and looked at Goodreads because I was like, am I the only one that feels this way? Is it the way that I consumed it? What happened with this book? And I wasn't. It was a pretty universal thought, was either you hated it because you were confused the whole time and never engaged with the characters, or you loved it because you liked the quirkiness in the writing style but were still confused the whole time. That's pretty much where the fence seemed to fall for Archive Undying. And while I can appreciate it, I did not enjoy it at all, and so unfortunately that was my least favorite book of the month of June. Okay guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me today as we talked about some of my best and worst books of the year. Let me know down in the comments if you guessed any of these books and what your best and worst books of 2023 have been so far. Has it been a good reading year for you? Have you been a little slumpy? Tell me all about it down in the comments below. As always, links to my Patreon, Instagram, Twitter, and Goodreads are all in the description box down below. If you liked this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe if you wanna, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!